The storm rolled in off the Louisiana bayou like a living thing. The sky, heavy with swollen clouds, sagged low over the cypress trees. Rain beat against the tin roof of Margaret Boudreau's creaking farmhouse, and thunder shook the windows as if someone were pounding at the glass, demanding to be let in. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, staring at the velvet jewelry box on her lap. It was small, no bigger than a loaf of bread, its dark blue fabric worn thin from years of hands sliding it open and shut. The clasp no longer gleamed gold, it had dulled to the color of old brass, but the weight of the box was undeniable. Inside rested the last relics of a family torn apart by grief, betrayal, and a secret she had kept locked away for nearly half a century. Her daughter-in-law Renee had stormed out of the house only hours before. Her words still hung in the air, sharp and bitter as broken glass. "Sell the jewelry, Margaret, you've got nothing else left. Nobody's coming to save you. Not now, not ever." Margaret's fingers trembled against the fabric of the box. She had heard Renee's voice rise above the storm, shrill and greedy, as though she were eager to strip away the last of Margaret's dignity. The jewelry, to Renee, was money, quick cash to be pawned for bills and debts, maybe even for one of her husband's gambling losses, but to Margaret, it was something else entirely. She knew Renee thought her old and foolish. What Renee didn't know was that Margaret had been guarding more than gemstones all these years. The real treasure wasn't inside the jewelry box at all, it was buried deeper, hidden under lies, secrets, and the kind of guilt that aged faster than any storm-weathered wood. As the lightning flickered, Margaret stood, joints aching, and carried the box toward the attic stairs. Dust swirled in the air as she pulled the cord, the creaking ladder descending like a groan from the house itself. Every step upward was heavy, but she climbed, the jewelry box clutched tight against her chest. The attic smelled of cedar and mildew, of years gone by. Cardboard boxes sagged under the weight of time, and yellowed photographs peeked out from cracked frames. Margaret set the jewelry box on an old trunk and opened it, just for a moment. Pearls glowed faintly in the dim light, their luster soft but eternal. Rings winked with dull diamonds, the kind bought by men trying to prove their devotion or wealth. And there, lying at the bottom, was the brooch, the one that still carried the faintest trace of his cologne. Not her late husband's, someone else's. The storm cracked outside, and for a brief second, Margaret thought she smelled the bay rum and tobacco again, as if the memory of him had seeped into the air, refusing to leave her alone. Her hand closed around the brooch, and tears she hadn't shed in decades pressed against her eyes. It wasn't the jewelry Renee wanted that mattered. It was this, the story it carried, the truth it contained, and the shadow it would cast if anyone ever found out. Margaret closed the lid and whispered to the empty attic, her voice shaking. "You think it's jewelry you want, Renee. I've got something worth more than you'll ever understand." But as the words left her lips, she felt the dread she'd been running from all these years curl around her spine, because secrets, like storms, never stayed quiet forever. And she knew this one was about to be uncovered. The next morning broke heavy and gray, the storm still lingering like a sulking guest that refused to leave. The bayou mist hung thick outside Margaret's window, cloaking the cypress knees in pale gauze. Her rocking chair creaked in rhythm with the rain, the jewelry box once again sitting unopened at her side. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the man tied to the brooch at the bottom of that box. His voice echoed in her dreams, smooth as whiskey, dangerous as fire. The sharp rattle of tires on gravel broke her trance. Margaret's heart jerked in her chest. She pushed herself to her feet, peering through the thin lace curtain. A dented silver SUV pulled into the yard, mud splattering as the wheels ground into the soggy earth. The driver's door flung open, and Renee stepped out, a cigarette dangling between her fingers even in the rain. Her expression was a mixture of defiance and desperation. Her lips painted a harsh crimson that bled against the washed-out morning. Behind her, stumbling from the passenger side, came Daniel, Margaret's son. His eyes were glassy, his shirt half-tucked, and the collar stained with last night's whiskey. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, glancing up at the house as if he half expected it to collapse in shame. Margaret's chest tightened. Daniel had once been her pride's mart, promising, with a laugh that carried across the bayou. But now he was hollowed, worn thin by years of bad deals and worse company. She had thought he might find his way again, yet every time Renee came around, his weakness grew sharper, and his loyalty to his mother weaker. The front door groaned open before Margaret even reached it. Renee waltzed in, shaking off her damp jacket, smoke trailing behind her like a warning signal. Daniel followed with slower steps, eyes darting everywhere but his mother's, while Renee snapped, planting her hands on her hips. "Did you think about it, Margaret? Did you think about doing the sensible thing? Selling what you don't need before the bank comes sniffing around?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She let the silence hang heavy, her gaze shifting from her son to the woman who spoke for him. She thought about the attic, the brooch, and the memories clawing at her ribs. She thought about how Renee's hands would tear through everything without a second thought. Finally, she spoke. "You don't know what's in that box, Renee." Renee laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Jewelry is jewelry. Don't get poetic on me. Pearls, diamonds, it doesn't matter. It's cash, and cash is what we need." Margaret turned to her son. "And you, Daniel, is this what you've come for too? To strip what's left of your family down to trinkets and pawn slips?" Daniel flinched, his lips parting. He looked like he wanted to speak, to say something soft, something of the boy she once knew. But before he could, Renee cut in. "Don't put this on him. He's trying to keep us afloat. We've got bills stacked taller than this house. You sit here in your chair with your memories while the world keeps moving. We need that jewelry." Margaret's breath caught. The world had kept moving, but it had taken her son with it, farther and farther from the truth he didn't even realize existed. She pressed her palms against the back of the rocking chair, grounding herself. "I'll tell you something, Renee," she said softly. "Not everything you can sell is worth owning, and not everything you can't sell is worth less." Renee rolled her eyes, flicking ash onto the floorboards. "Lord, you sound like a preacher. I don't need riddles, Margaret. I need money." The storm of silence that followed was cut only by the creak of the rocking chair as Margaret lowered herself back into it. Her fingers brushed the jewelry box again, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she fixed her gaze on Daniel. "Your father, your real father, knew the value of what's in here. He told me once it wasn't meant to be worn or sold, but remembered." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Daniel blinked, slowly, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, real father?" Renee's head snapped around. "What did you just say?" Margaret's pulse raced. Her heart thundered louder than the rain on the roof. She hadn't meant to reveal it. Not now, not like this. But the brooch had dragged the truth closer to the surface than it had ever been. "You heard me," she whispered, her voice almost trembling. "Not everything in this house is what you think it is. Not everything in your life, Daniel, is what it seems." The silence that followed was jagged and dangerous. Daniel's face went pale, his mouth parting as though he were struggling for air. Renee's lips curled, her eyes narrowing, suspicion gleaming. "You've been keeping something," Renee hissed, taking a step closer. "And I'll find out what it is. Jewelry, secrets, whatever. You're not taking it to your grave." Margaret clutched the box to her chest, rocking gently, eyes fixed on her son. The storm rattled the windows again, but this time, it sounded like a warning. Because, for the first time, the secret she had buried all those years ago was clawing its way into the open, and there would be no turning back. The house held its breath after Margaret's last words. Rain ticked in the gutters, soft and stubborn, and somewhere in the bayou a bullfrog croaked like a hinge needing oil. Renee's cigarette flared and faded. Daniel stood as if he'd forgotten where to put his hands. "What did you mean?" he asked at last. "By your real father." "Sit," Margaret said, leading them to the kitchen. "If we're opening old doors, we do it sitting down so we can walk back out." Chicory steamed from the kettle, laying its bittersweet scent over the enamel stove and the old linoleum. Margaret poured into thick cups and waited for her hands to stop trembling. Renee paced. "We don't have time for story hour." "You'll make time," Margaret answered, not looking up. "You've waited years for that box. You can spare minutes for the truth that comes with it." Daniel cupped the coffee and stared into its darkness. "Say it." Margaret folded her fingers together. "The man who raised Eugen loved you ferociously. But love and blood aren't always the same thing." She looked past them to the rain making new maps on the window. "Before I married, there was a man I thought I'd never have to explain. Gabriel Landry. Riverwork barges, engines, anything that kept him close to water and far from promises. He smelled of bay rum and tobacco. He laughed like a song he hadn't learned the words to." Renee's mouth curved. "How romantic." Margaret let the jab pass. "When I learned I was pregnant, Gabriel promised to do right. The promise drowned in the first storm. I married the man who could give a child a name and a roof that didn't leak. John knew. Daniel's cup rattled. He knew. He looked at me the way a lighthouse looks at a wreck, and decided saving was better than judging. Her voice thinned. He raised you as his own. I tried to make that true in every way that mattered. Silence lengthened. The smell of chicory was suddenly the smell of Sunday morning's mass, ironed shirts, a boy's laughter. Daniel's eyes shone as if smoke stung them. Renee watched Margaret with a hunter's patience. What does any of this have to do with the jewelry? Renee snapped. Past mistakes don't pay present bills. The jewelry is bait, Margaret said softly. You keep biting the glitter, while the hook is somewhere else entirely. Speak plain. I will after he hears what he's owed. Margaret turned to her son. When the mill cut hours, your father took nights on shrimp boats. When you needed braces, he sold his shotgun. When your lungs turned mean that winter you were 9, he sold, she swallowed, his father's ring. Daniel pressed his fingers to his eyes. When he dropped his hands, they shook. And Gabriel, did he try to see me? Twice. Drunk the first time, sober the second. John sent him away both times. Once for your safety, once because Gabriel finally understood he'd only break what was whole. I asked him never to return. Renee clicked her tongue. Pretty tale. Still doesn't pay the light bill. Here's how this goes. You give me the jewelry, we pawn it, and we all stop drowning. Margaret's gaze stayed on Daniel. I kept quiet because silence was cheaper than shame. But silence accrues interest like any debt. She stood. Come with me. Renee slid into the doorway. Over my dead body. Step aside, Margaret said, voice low. Or I call in every neighbor to hear what you do with their borrowed money, while my son drinks not to see. Renee shifted, then moved. They climbed the attic ladder, boards complaining at the weight of truth. Heat pressed close beneath the rafters. Dust turned light into velvet. The velvet box waited on the trunk where Margaret had left it. She passed it by and opened the cedar chest John had built. Letters, a jacket that smelled of camphor, a cigar tin full of buttons and screws, the useful smallness of a life. These are from Gabriel, she said, lifting the ribboned bundles. Words sent in place of showing up. She handed them to Daniel. He took them like something that might burn. Then she opened the box. Pearls glowed with soft patience. Rings winked. The brooch gleamed with the sleepy pride of a keepsake that had outlived its promise. Renee's eyes sharpened. Finally, not yet. Margaret lifted the velvet tray to reveal the thin cavity beneath. Wood scraped. From the space she drew a folded document, edges browned, the parish stamp a faded bruise. Daniel frowned. What is it? What I sold, Margaret answered, voice heavy with the river's pull. She spread the paper on the trunk. Easement and right of passage, Cypress Road boat launch. Renee blinked. Some muddy strip of swamp. Who cares, the shrimpers, Margaret said. Half the parish puts in there when the main ramp floods. Your father taught you to cast from that bank. It's where we scattered John's ashes the morning the bayou ran like polished slate. Her fingers trembled over the stamp. I sold the public right to that launch 30 years ago. The price wasn't money. It was your birth certificate without Gabriel's name. Your life without Gabriel's reach. I sold our neighbors' convenience and a little of their freedom, and I pay for it every Sunday with eyes on my back. That's what I sold. Something worth more than jewelry. The attic held its breath again. Even the rain eased, as if the sky leaned in. Margaret went on. The parish has wanted this land back for years. The men who brokered that old deal, the ones who drink with your friends and call it charity, have been waiting for me to die so they can push a marina through what we call childhood. They don't want pearls, Renee. They want what I bought with my silence. Renee recovered fast, then sell it back. Make them pay. We fixed the bills. You can't easily sell what you gave up to save a soul, Margaret said. All you can do is choose whether the price was fair and whether to keep paying. She looked at Daniel. The attic light drew a pale crown around his graying hair. Son, I am sorry for every mile of road I made you walk in the dark. I'll sign what needs signing if it lets you stand straighter when you pass the dock. But the jewelry stays. It's the only lie I never told. Renee snorted. You're delirious. That deed is the payday. Those pearls are just noise, Margaret finished gently. They glitter so you won't listen to what hurts. A small chuff of laughter escaped Daniel, half grief, half relief. He lifted the deed with unsteady hands, then set it down as if it weighed more than iron. He touched the letters, the brooch, and the velvet lip of the box. He looked at his mother. Okay, he said, the word breaking on a ridge of emotion. Okay, Renee bristled. Okay, what? Okay, we do this her way. He drew a long breath, steadier on the exhale. We talk to the parish, we see what their offer ever really was, and who's been circling. We stop taking help from men who call it kindness while they sharpen knives. His gaze slid to Renee, and we stop pawning memories to pay for bad nights. Color rose in Renee's cheeks. You wouldn't have a roof without me. You won't have a husband without the truth, Margaret said, not unkindly. I'm done selling silence. If this family drowns, it won't be because I kept my mouth shut. Wind pressed against the gable. The house answered with an old, rib-deep groan. Downstairs, the kettle clicked as it cooled. Outside, the bayou exhaled a mist that turned sunlight to milk. Daniel folded the deed and slid it into his pocket as carefully as if it were a bird he meant to set free. He lifted the brooch and studied it, then returned it to its bed. Tomorrow, he said. We start tomorrow, Margaret nodded. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard popped, settling. The sound felt like a yes. But as they climbed back down the ladder, a car's engine rumbled up the drive low, deliberate, familiar. Renee's eyes flashed triumph and fear in equal measure. Who's that? Daniel asked. Margaret didn't answer. She already knew. Some debts preferred to be collected in person. The following days in Louisiana seemed wrapped in a haze of cicada song and the slow dripping of time. Margaret often sat on her front porch with a sweating glass of sweet tea, staring out at the gravel road that led to the bayou, her mind wrestling with the storm that had begun the moment she opened her grandmother's note. The letter had ignited something in her chest that felt equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. It wasn't just the jewelry in question anymore. It was the way the note suggested that the jewelry was never meant to be hers in the way her husband and his family assumed. There was something more, something hidden, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was tied to secrets older than her marriage, older than even her grandmother's wrinkled hands and watchful eyes. She tried to ignore it, tried to carry on with the routines of the small Louisiana town where the air smelled of magnolia blossoms and fried catfish. But her husband, Robert, had grown restless. The more he pressured her to sell the jewelry, the more she pushed back, until their once tender conversations had become brittle exchanges. One evening, as thunder rumbled over the distant bayou and rain streaked against the windows, Robert finally broke. You think you can just ignore me? His voice had the clipped edge of a man who'd lost patience. He paced the living room, his boots heavy against the creaking wood. Your grandmother left you that box for us to use, Margaret, not for you to sit on like some dragon hoarding gold. Margaret's throat tightened. It wasn't for you, she whispered, her fingers twisted around the hem of her skirt. She left it for me. And maybe it's not what you think it is. Robert's head snapped toward her, suspicion flaring in his eyes. What do you mean by that? She hesitated. Should she tell him about the note, the delicate handwriting that had suggested more than just inheritance, but something in her gut screamed to keep it hidden, to guard it like a secret flame in a storm. Nothing, she said finally, her voice small. Just nothing. His jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. Instead, he grabbed his coat from the rack and stormed out into the rain, slamming the door behind him. Margaret sat frozen, listening to the downpour hammering the tin roof, every beat sounding like a warning she couldn't yet interpret. That night, sleep didn't come. When she finally rose, restless, she padded barefoot across the floor and pulled the box from where she had hidden it under the bed. She set it on the table, the lamp casting a faint amber glow across its surface. For a long time, she stared at the latch, her heart thudding like a drum. She thought again of her grandmother's eyes, in those final weeks, watery but sharp, like they saw beyond what anyone else did. One day, you'll understand, the old woman had whispered with her last breath. Margaret clicked the latch open. The box creaked, releasing the faint, musty scent of cedar and dust. Inside lay the jewelry Robert had demanded she sell. A string of pearls dulled with age, a gold locket with its hinge rusted, a brooch encrusted with tiny, cracked stones. But tucked beneath them, hidden against the velvet lining, was something else. A folded piece of parchment, brittle with time. Her breath caught as she slid it free. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looping and dark. She unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling. Margaret, it began. This jewelry is not what it seems. Sell it, and you lose everything. Keep it, and you may yet uncover what was lost. The words felt like a cipher, as though the ink itself carried weight. Beneath them, a faint map was drawn, a crude sketch of the Louisiana bayou, a bend in the river marked with an X. Her heart pounded as realization dawned. This wasn't about wealth in the form of jewels. Her grandmother had hidden something far more valuable, something tied to their family's past. But before she could study the map further, a sound jolted her, a soft crick from the porch. Margaret froze. The lamp flickered in the draft of the open window. Someone was out there, watching. She quickly folded the parchment, sliding it back beneath the jewelry, and closed the box with a click. Her chest heaved as she reached for the curtain and parted it just enough to see a shadow slipping across the yard. A figure, tall and deliberate, disappearing toward the road. The next morning, the town was alive with gossip. At the diner, whispers followed her as she walked past. Some said her husband had been drinking late at the tavern, ranting about his wife keeping secrets. Others claimed they saw a stranger in town, an unfamiliar man in a dark hat, asking about Margaret's family. Margaret sat at a corner booth, coffee growing cold in front of her, mind racing. Her grandmother's cryptic message, the hidden map, the shadow on her porch, all of it tangled together like Spanish moss, hanging thick over the water. And now eyes in the town were turning toward her, hungry for scandal. That night, she locked the jewelry box inside the old armoire and pressed her back against it, as if her body could serve as a barrier to the secrets it contained. She whispered into the empty room, "What did you hide, Grandma?" But no answer came, only the distant croak of frogs from the bayou and the sound of her own heartbeat, heavy with fear and anticipation. Margaret knew then that she couldn't keep the secret buried any longer. She would have to follow the map, and she wasn't sure who might be following her. The Louisiana bayou has a way of swallowing sound. When Margaret first stepped off the gravel road and onto the damp path that led into the thicket, it was as if the world hushed itself around her. Even the crickets, so loud at night around her house, seemed quieter here. The cicadas buzzed in the distance, and somewhere deeper in the swamp, a bullfrog croaked its slow, mournful note. She carried the jewelry box in a canvas satchel against her hip, and in her hand, carefully unfolded, was the fragile map her grandmother had hidden. Every step she took sent the faint scent of mud and water plants into the air. Her shoes sank slightly into the soft ground, the hem of her skirt brushing against cattails that leaned lazily in the humid breeze. The air was heavy, thick with the perfume of wild jasmine, salt, and something ancient that clung to the moss-draped cypress trees. The map showed a bend in the river, an X drawn at its edge. Margaret's eyes scanned her surroundings, searching for anything familiar. She had grown up playing near the shallows with cousins, but this part of the bayou had always been forbidden her. Grandmother, warning them with stern words and eyes that carried an unspoken fear. "Stay away from the old bend," she'd say. "That place doesn't forget." Now Margaret wondered if those warnings had been less about danger and more about protection. Protection of a secret. By the time she reached the first fork in the water, sweat was running down her temples, her breath quick and shallow. She paused, kneeling near the bank to compare the map to the river's curve. Yes, this was it. Just beyond a cluster of trees, with bark twisted like old hands, the river bent sharply before widening into a pool, and there, right where the parchment showed the X, the land jutted out slightly, forming a small clearing. Her pulse quickened. She tucked the map carefully back into her satchel and pushed forward. The cicadas seemed to grow louder, buzzing in chorus, as though warning her to turn back. She pressed on until she stood in the clearing itself. At first, it looked like nothing, just earth, roots, and water swirling slow and dark. But then she noticed the stones, 3 of them, half buried in mud, arranged in a shape too deliberate to be natural, a triangle. Margaret crouched, brushing her hands over the damp ground until her fingers struck something hard. She dug gently, mud packing under her nails, until the edge of wood emerged. Her breath hitched. It was a box, smaller than the jewelry case, but older, its wood swollen from years beneath the earth. She pulled until it gave way with a wet sucking sound, sending a shiver through her bones. With trembling hands, she set it on her lap. For a moment, she just stared. The box seemed alive in its stillness, as though it had been waiting for her. Finally, she pried it open. Inside was not treasure, not in the way Robert had demanded. There were no glittering stones, no gold coins. Instead, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were pages, letters, journals, and brittle photographs. She lifted one photograph with shaking hands, a sepia image of her grandmother as a young woman. standing beside a man Margaret had never seen before. The man wore a dark suit, his hand resting gently on her grandmother's arm, and his eyes, sharp-piercing, were filled with an intensity that unsettled her. Beneath the photograph was a letter written in that same looping hand. If you are reading this, it means I could not tell you myself. What is here is more than jewelry, more than family heirlooms. It is truth. Our blood is tied to things people would rather forget, and to people who would rather see it buried. You must guard it well, or it will be taken from you. Margaret's breath trembled. She glanced around the clearing, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, as if the cypress trees themselves leaned closer to listen. Then snap, a branch cracked behind her. Margaret spun, clutching the box to her chest. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, the same shadow she had seen slipping from her porch days before. He stepped forward, hat low over his brow, his boots sinking into the mud. His voice carried low, like a warning growl. That doesn't belong to you. Margaret's throat closed. It was my grandmother's. He shook his head slowly. Your grandmother kept it safe, but now, you've gone digging where you shouldn't have. Her heart pounded as the air grew thick with dread. She backed toward the bend of the river, clutching the box. Who are you? She demanded. The man tilted his head. Someone who's been waiting for you to find that. And now that you have, you'll have to make a choice. The croak of the bullfrog echoed louder, almost like a drumbeat underlining the moment. Margaret's knuckles whitened around the box as fear and determination tangled within her. The jewelry, the letters, the map, it was all leading to this confrontation. But what choice did she have to make? And what price would it demand? Margaret's breath came sharp and fast as the stranger's words hung in the humid air. The swamp felt tighter somehow, as if the trees and the buzzing cicadas pressed closer, watching her next move. She clutched the old box against her chest, its weight no longer just wood and paper, but the weight of generations. The man stepped forward slowly, each boot sinking slightly into the mud, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. That box holds more than you realize, he said, his voice gravelly yet steady. It's not about jewelry, girl, it's about blood. Margaret's heart pounded harder. Then why hide it? Why bury it out here in the swamp? His lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. Because sometimes the truth is too dangerous in daylight. Your grandmother knew that. She made a choice. And now, you'll have to make one too. The words echoed inside her like a riddle. A choice. What kind of choice? She glanced down at the fragile papers, at the faces staring back at her from sepia photographs. Her grandmother, strong even in youth. That man with the piercing eyes. Behind the letters, there was more. A folded deed to land she didn't recognize. Ink faded but still legible, signed generations ago. A contract, binding, with names she did not know but sensed were powerful. It was then Margaret realized the jewelry had never been the true inheritance. The box was proof of lineage, of a claim on something hidden beneath Louisiana's quiet, swampy surface. Land, wealth, maybe even secrets that had toppled others before. Why me? Margaret whispered, her voice trembling but firm enough to cut through the cicadas. Why now? The man tilted his head, stepping closer until she could see his face, lined sun-darkened with eyes a cold steel gray. Because you went looking. You opened the ground. That makes you part of it, whether you wanted to be or not. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand straighter. And if I refuse? He studied her, silent for a moment, then said in a low tone, then you'll lose everything. The land, the truth, maybe even your family's safety. Refusal never came free. Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. The humid night seemed to press down heavier, the scent of wet earth thick in her nose. She thought of Robert's greedy insistence on selling her grandmother's jewelry for quick cash. He had no idea that what he pushed her toward was bigger, darker, and more valuable than he could imagine. The man's voice broke her thoughts. You're standing at a crossroads, child. Bury it again and walk away, or claim it and face what comes. But you must decide. Margaret swallowed hard. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, as though the storm itself waited for her answer. She clutched the box tighter, the papers inside rustling like whispers from her grandmother. Her eyes lifted, meeting the stranger's cold stare. The choice was no longer about money. It was about legacy, danger, and truth. The night deepened, and Margaret knew the next step she took would shape everything that came after. The box felt heavier in Margaret's arms as she carried it out of the swamp. Each step through the muck was like wading through her family's past, through every silence her grandmother had kept, every sacrifice she had made. The stranger's words replayed in her head: bury it again and walk away, or claim it and face what comes. By the time she reached the gravel road where her car waited, the cicadas had quieted, replaced by the steady drum of thunder rolling closer. The air smelled of wet pine and iron. She slid the box onto the passenger seat and sank behind the wheel, hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She thought of Robert waiting at home, probably pacing in their kitchen, muttering about overdue bills, already planning how much money he'd squeeze from whatever he believed she was selling. He didn't care about legacy, only control. He had always spoken as if everything she touched belonged to him. But tonight was different. Tonight, Margaret knew something Robert didn't. The jewelry was a distraction. The papers in the box proved her family's name was written into Louisiana's bones. They showed ownership of land that stretched wider than she had ever imagined. Land buried under oil fields, swamp tracks, and old sugar estates. A fortune not measured in pearls and gold, but in the very earth itself. When she reached her driveway, the house loomed dark against the storm-lit sky. She killed the engine, clutching the box to her chest like a lifeline. As she stepped inside, Robert was waiting in the hallway. His eyes immediately locked onto the box. "Well," he demanded, his tone sharp and hungry. "Did you sell it? How much? Don't tell me you wasted time." Margaret's jaw tightened. She had rehearsed this moment in her head on the drive home, but now, standing in front of him, the truth felt like fire on her tongue. "I didn't sell it," she said softly but firmly. Robert's eyes flared. "What do you mean? You didn't, Margaret. We need that money." She set the box down on the table between them, sliding the brittle papers free. She spread them out like a hand of cards. "This isn't jewelry, Robert. It's worth more than you could ever imagine. My grandmother left me proof of land, acres of it, a legacy you tried to throw away." For once, Robert faltered. His face drained of color as he leaned over the papers, trying to make sense of the faded signatures, the seals pressed into parchment. His lips moved without sound, his greed struggling to keep up with what his eyes saw. Margaret's voice steadied. "You told me to sell the jewelry. You thought that was all I had. But I chose differently. I chose what she really wanted me to find." Lightning cracked outside, throwing their faces into sharp relief. Robert's expression was a twisted masked part OW part rage. He reached for the papers, but Margaret pulled them back, her grip fierce. "No," she said, her voice cutting like glass. "These don't belong to you. They never did." Robert stared at her, his mouth opening, then closing. For the first time in years, he looked powerless. Margaret gathered the documents back into the box, pressing the lid closed. Her grandmother's whisper seemed to echo in the thunder outside. "Protect it, claim it, it's yours." She walked past Robert, the box pressed against her chest. Behind her, he stood motionless, unable to follow. The storm broke as she opened the front door, rain pouring, washing the air clean, striking the earth with a force that felt like renewal. Margaret stepped into the storm, the box secure in her arms, her heart steady. The jewelry was gone. The fight for money was over. What remained was far greater: truth, legacy, and a freedom Robert could never take. Her grandmother had trusted her to choose. Tonight, she finally had.